Morgen. Bitte um Verzeihung. Wir haben vereinbart, dass wir das ganze Gespräch auf Englisch führen und in der Sonne. So, welcome David Claerbout.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in the sun. Actually, the sun is sometimes a subject matter for you. The real sun, but also the digital one.
I feel that projector light, whether in a cinema or a digital projection elsewhere, like in here, is a little bit like a sun. It's just an usurpator, a sun usurpator, a replacement sun. And later, I think I made the first piece where I thematized the sun in 2004, and that was the Bordeaux piece, where the sun was moving as it does in its own pace during an entire day. And actors were performing a short film that lasted about 10 minutes each, which then they had to repeat, and they got ever more tired and exhausted until they started making mistakes. And we kept on doing that until the nightfall. And I guess that's the first piece in which I tried to use the sun as a narrator, which is a very unlikely actor. Because also, just like the weeds in Olympia, the speed of that movement is too slow, and people usually are too impatient to keep on waiting for it. So this impatience, of course, and the movement of the sun, these are two things that are recurrent.
And also the projector light, because there's one instant during travel where you look directly into the light.
I found it fascinating how also in a projection, but one could say also on a television screen or on any other screen, when the sun appears from behind a tree, for example, she does hurt the eye. And in fact, if you measure the lumens coming out of a television screen or a projector light falling on the wall, this is nothing. It doesn't have the capacity to hurt your eye. But memory does all the work. And these are these instances that I'd love to use where physical memory would be all you need to generate something that is profoundly present, or that is simply there, which is not just a reference, but which is something that you can remember and that you do remember spontaneously without thinking. It's probably this perception without thinking which is quite important, isn't it?
And there's another aspect about the sun, which is the light in general, because the light is the basics of photography and the basics of film and the basic of everything which is kind of an imagery that can be reproduced. And also they say light is kind of the central substance nowadays, because it's kind of in all our devices and facilities, and it's the basics of information and all that stuff.
Yeah, I guess light belongs to the category of motion, in the sense that it's well, I mean, actually, I wanted to say something else, that when indeed working with light and how photography or the mechanical image lives because of the grace of light. And one has to think well about this phenomenon of a light source passing through a concentrated device, a piece of glass, and then captured, but capturing is not actually the right word, it's to land on a surface. There is this almost angel-like encounter of a phenomenon, light, landing very softly on a very hard surface. And it has a quasi-immaterial aspect. And now I contrast that with what I call dark optics, which is images that have nothing in common with the camera, except for the imitation of the camera, and that are made entirely out of information. And information is crucial in the sense that I try to work with things that are profoundly artificial, synthetic, such as pictorial 3D, and work my way out towards, from dark optics towards light optics, one could say. But light optics, namely photography, is a phenomenon of the past, and is gradually being replaced by information optics or dark optics.
And this equals also a kind of new materialism, right? But maybe it's better to explain it. There is at the Kunsthaus some sort of development. In the ground floor there's the Quiet Shore, which is still a film or a still based on photography, though manipulated digitally. And on the top floor there's Olympia, which is entirely digital.
So essentially, up front, we have to admit one thing: is that every image is manipulated. There is no such thing as a unmanipulated image. And indeed, in an increasingly digital environment where ever more important and less important aspects of life become immaterial, essentially communication, one should say what happens to matter. And the mistake that the cyberpunk movement of the 90s made was to celebrate the immateriality of cyberspace. The mistake there lies in the fact that the immateriality never really occurs. There is a new materiality, but not an absence of materiality. And our bodies, whatever they get in front of around them, even if it's a 3D glasses or if it's a 3D sound, our receptors will always be what they are, and will probably react strangely to this new materiality. And I've tried to explore that probably unconsciously, first in the Quiet Shore, where water and ice occupy the same surface and share the same image, but nevertheless are very confusing materials. Water and ice, of course, as an image, not only mean a crystallization of a liquid entity, but also mean temperature. They also mean differences in temperature. And these are things, again, like I said, these are a phenomenon which one lives with without having to think about them. So that makes most of my ideas and most of the pieces work with motives rather than with content. Things like political content are really, really coming through the back door very slowly in my work. Then on the second floor we have travel, which is entirely made out of pictorial 3D, so not the glasses 3D, but pictorial 3D. And travel taught me a lot about the changes from lens-based images towards information-based images, and the reduction of diversity that goes hand in hand with that. It's altogether quite a different adventure than the Quiet Shore, but one has to see that the Kunsthaus really has these few phenomenal floors which really take you up and at the same time disorient because you're never quite sure in which floor you are. And so I think when we made the exhibition, we tried to introduce exemplary works for each of the, let's say, chapters in the pieces that I've made. No, so they're all quite different propositions. And then in the floor above that we have, I always mix up third and second and fourth, so I don't even try anymore. Above that we have radio piece, which works with, one could say, a 360-degree sound, but a very monotonous, linear image, and proposes a almost virtuoso play with surround sound in between our two ears. This is nothing new. Other artists have done that. However, actually, I never know what the subject matter is when I make a piece, and in radio piece it took me many years to understand, and still today I'm a little bit confused sometimes when I think about the work, what exactly the point is. But I suppose it has to do with celebrating literally the space between the two ears as real estate, as a space that can be explored and exploited when there's no more living space around. And then finally the fourth work, Olympia, brings back many of the worries in other works, but most notably the celebration that's in my work for everything that are background processes. So everything that is not human, everything that doesn't pretend to be the center of the universe, which is difficult in film, because film is very much like the perception of the eyes, very much forward movement.
The extras become the actors.
The extras become the actors. So that is a tough act to do. And the techniques that I've been choosing throughout my career, one could say they became ever more complicated, but that's actually not really true. They were just always, I try to look for the right answers for a phenomenon. But in fact, one should forget one illusion, is that artists purposefully choose a technique in the light of a certain idea. I think that's a lie. There is an exchange between techniques and ideas always. There cannot possibly be a one-way action. It's not the artist choosing the materials, it's partly also the materials choosing the artist.
Do you agree with Adorno, who said that advanced art should always work with the most advanced medium?
It's a little bit early in the morning to admit that this would be also systematically the case. The worry that I have is that, but also I have kind of my method to fight against it, is that often when working with the newest technologies, one in fact celebrates them, and one has the mouth open and is in awe for these new technologies. And this is of course a problem, because these new technologies at one point become redundant, and then they are able to make out of the work of art something that is a nostalgic object of the past. And one should therefore treat the newest technologies always like a ruin. Or at least this is what I try to do. And when we think about Olympia, for example, we had yesterday something that occurred which I thought was interesting. It was compared to a painting by Anselm Kiefer. I guess it was in one of the interviews. And it was about restoration in 100 years. And of course, I, as also my collectors worry about how it has to continue with Olympia. But I realized that in 100 years, Olympia is far easier to restore than would be a painting of Anselm Kiefer. Because every second young person will actually know the language out of which it's built more intimately. And the Kiefer will have to be restored by very expensive experts.
And do you consider yourself a painter?
I think there is, one has always to pass through modernity. When one receives an education, one always has to pass through modernity and say, look, is modernity now, is it a rift, or maybe should we not blow it up that much, and should we say modernity in fact probably never happened, and it only partially happened, so we might be confronted with all the residue of modernity. And I think I belong to the club of people who do not regard modernity as a break, as a rupture. And then from that moment on, one could say, yes, in the 1860s, when photography came, she caused a shock of the senses. She upset a whole generation of where the pictorial regime of painting was the dominant one, but one could say, yeah, of course, since Goya, painting disintegrates, literally into a ruin, but a very beautiful one. And then photography causes this blow to painting, and from there on, painting retrieves itself in, one could say, in einen Reservat, how do you say it, a natural reserve, where the rest of the universe is kind of destroyed through photography. But in fact, I don't think it is that way, it happened that way necessarily. And from there on, one could say, yes, I might consider myself a painter, but not as a painterly painter. So not in terms of nostalgia. Also, if one would then extend this logic which I have, that there was no rift and there was no rupture, one should say painting has remained in this reservoir for all this time, but in fact continued in Hollywood and later in the gaming industry, where painting resides right now.
And the same is true for music, because there's some sort of popular music, and then there's this kind of serious music, and you're dealing also with kind of the between them. The therapeutic music in travel is very interesting. I tried to listen to it very closely yesterday, and if you listen to the first few harmonies, and then the flute comes in, and you start the imagery with what Heidegger would call a Lichtung, again the sun and the light, and also this reservoir, so a kind of a field within the woods where the light intrudes, and there's also a bench which would invite you as a passing by person to sit, to rest. But as a matter of fact, you are invited as a viewer not to rest, but to follow the camera, the supposedly camera eye, into this wood. And the music joins you.
In travel, we encounter again, I think, this phenomenon of light, but this time is supposed to make you fall asleep or to relax, because that is the origin of the soundtrack.
But also into darkness, right?
Also into darkness, yeah. Yeah, darkness or the illusion of darkness. The idea for travel is a very old one. It dates back to before I actually started my work. I collected, for some strange reason which I never knew, I collected relaxation music. Probably partly out of irony, but also because I didn't know why, but relaxation music gave me a lot of ideas for films, one after the other. And it was probably the easiness of which images come above or to the surface through this, one could say, politically simplified music, or aesthetically simplified music. And I kept just one idea, and that was this one, for many years, almost 17 years. And at one point when I felt the technology was right to make it, because that was the problem, that was one of the reasons why I didn't produce it in those 17 years, is because I went in and out of forest time and again every year, almost until I felt really depressed. About finding a place which almost looked perfect and then again not. And I realized that what this music does, it brings you in a journey through several different spatial concepts. It introduces, so it starts with light, goes into darkness, and then it goes in a ever deeper and larger subterranean space, one could almost say.
And it becomes more and more intimate.
Yes, it becomes larger and more intimate, and you're kind of buried underneath the trees, and you kind of give yourself over to this large, dark space until...
But there's also some sort of hesitation, I at least felt it, because you force me into something which I don't really like, because it's so poetic, it's so idyllic, it's too much.
Yeah, that too much is, of course, not ideal for an artist's career, because I imagined, but that was also the irony of the work, that in a cultural place or a cultured or with cultured people, travel would cause indignation in a way. Like, how dare he not use a better soundtrack? And how dare he propose such
a wonderful world.
Simple, yeah, exactly. But they, you know, these images reminded me of populist rhetorics, where someone will explain to you that everything is simple. And the thing I always felt when thinking about the work in those 17 years was, in fact, let me just make the work, and it will never have been so confusing. The exchange between how the forest feels, the size of it, the monumentality, and then also the banality, contradicts the music. And you have a feeling, you have actually two energies. You have an upwards going energy and you have a downwards going energy, one of enchantment and one of disenchantment. And I love to explore how they would work together. And that brings me, if I may, to something that I always found fascinating, is to have the existence of two completely opposing phenomena. So it's in a way a duality of elements that should not live together, but that do live together and quite well.
For example?
Well, in travel we have the upwards and the downwards movement, or
light and darkness, or brightness and darkness?
Light and darkness. I could go probably through any of the pieces. If we would think, for example, about the Algiers sections of A Happy Moment, which is a little bit similar to The Quiet Shore, except it does have a soundtrack. There we would have almost, again, a theistic impression of verticality. The birds and then these people on the square of the Kasbah of Algiers, which is in a way feels very liberating. It's all about light, there's a lot of sun, and there is really only an optimistic setting or optimistic motive. But over time, and that brings me to this important block, which is duration. When you stay put, when you stay still and you you sit in front of it, something changes, and this light impression changes into a certain heaviness. And these aspects, which contradict one another, actually get a second chance in a digital environment. This is important. In a digital environment, nothing of the paradoxes that used to exist are the same. And that is actually quite a challenge to start to live with a new materiality and to start to make a synthesis out of... at the same time, it's upsetting because I think it makes a person doubt about one's own perception. If the surrounding world and the things that we see in the films, what do they have in common? Everything is fake, of course, and does that mean that our perception is fake? Yeah. But this negotiation between two opposing partners, one could say almost two partners or two things that are at war. And whether it's light or darkness, or it's always a duality. It's always something that doesn't belong to them.
It's flatness in space as well, right? Deepness.
Absolutely. I mean, space and time are, I think, anyway, the two aspects in between we travel always. Yeah.
But they are not oppositions, are they?
Actually, there is one opposition which is very clear, and that is that of the watch, where a spatial concept is imposed upon time, which generates a linear impression of time passing between the past, the present, and the future. But no one says that this is how time passes. No? Albert Einstein famously once replied to Henri Bergson, when Henri Bergson complicated the concept of time, and Einstein said, "Come on, forget it. The watch is enough. Yeah, that's all we need." And I think we have adopted that. And one has to say, if you think about it, every aspect of life is measured to the clock. Every aspect of life, including death. So that is one example of where a spatial concept is superimposed on time. The most difficult one, I think, is the aspect of duration, because strictly speaking, one can say nothing about it.
Although Bergson said many things about it.
Yes. Well, he tried. He tried to speak about it.
What is it for you? What is duration? Is it a sense? Is it a feeling? Is it a kind of an imagination? Is it a perception? Is it an observation?
So it's certainly, I would avoid saying it's a feeling, because feelings dominate every aspect of decision making. I think time is essentially something transformative. And you have the time of plants, you have the time of human beings, you have the time of holidays, you have the time of working, you have the time of efficiency. So it's very stretchable, that's one could say the least. In meditation, time becomes spatial.
Is it the time that is not measurable?
Time is not measurable.
No, I mean duration.
Yes, of course. In that sense, one comes back time and again to the conclusion that measuring it really is a hard thing to do. But it's also something liberating. If you can, let's say, a time of death, if somebody dies, he has died at this hour, this minute, this second, it makes it easier to work yourself through.
To accept it.
To a mourning process, a process of acceptance. If you can place an event in chronologically in time, so it's both a blessing and a curse. Yeah? But the time of film and of moving image has a certain violent aspect to it. It goes, I think I said it yesterday, so I'm sorry if I repeat myself. It has an extra violence to it, which the eye cannot analyze. So it is the filmic image is one of these phenomena which are impossible to analyze while you're looking at it, which is why it is hard to remember a film and much easier to remember a photograph, of course. So there's a certain almost, how should you say, arrogance or dominant aspect of the moving image that gives the message to the body that it is a technology that's going too fast for analysis. And that brings me to the aspect of immersion, of course. I think we haven't spoken much about immersion, but the history of painting and the history of an image is a history of immersion. It would suffice probably to study that. And of course, so is gaming, and so is cinema, and so is the moving image.
But others would say and object to you and say the history of the image, and at least the history of the image since the 1500s or so, is the history of creating a distance to an object, not getting involved in it.
Well, yes, there we go again with the paradox and with the duality, of course, is that the distance at the same time is also the measure for the proximity. And you feel that in Van Eyck is one of my beloved examples, where despite the proximity of the textures in the Ghent altar, and despite the fact that you have such a presence of light, the surface is light years away from you. So there's this impossibility of connection.
And there's also the presence of angels and plants.
Yes, indeed. One of the I was just a little something different actually, but we were yesterday talking about paradise. I also again I forgot with who, and I remember just then that all images of paradise were important as long as humankind was suffering, and life in the Middle Ages was quite terrible. Your tooth start to ache from age 9, so to speak, and by the age 28, you completely sick and swollen with all kind of bacteria. That this concept of paradise is slowly has crystallized into something actually quite real. We live three times the age that people lived in the Middle Ages, etc. Why do I say that? I don't know exactly. Well, never mind. That was just one thought.
I think we spoke about that. So in the medieval times, so the ontology was quite clear. This was a hierarchy, a vertical hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So starting with the stones, then the plants, and on top of it, the animals, mm-hmm. and then human beings. It's clear they are at the center, and then the angels and the archangels, and on top of it, the gods or God. Mm-hmm. And now we get the feeling that it's like turned like in a glass of sand. So, and the ontology turns upside down. So the most important are the stones, and then the plants, and for example wood, and then the animals, and then the human beings, and everything which was on top of it, or used to be above of it, like the angels and the archangels, which I think would equal ideas, fantasies, ideologies, mm-hmm. Utopias. Mm-hmm. They are almost gone, like God. So we live in a totally secularized world, mm-hmm. and this concerns also the digital, and your idea of the dark optics and kind of a new materialism. There's no place for this new material in this hierarchy, either between stones and plants, or where are they? Or there's no place for them, mm-hmm. for these new things.
Not yet. The way we think about them now, they seem to belong more to memory than in any other place. Don't seem to be part of the experienced life or vita activa. And these materials all seem to have in common that they exclude bodily experience, they exclude touch and other senses. But we actually don't know yet what the shape of them is. I think we can say that they're in between worlds. And I think, for example, about the material that you can feel in the oil workers piece, which I've made several years ago, where you have a title of a work which is referring to oil because of the Shell company of Nigeria and the workers returning home. It's just a word. It's only a word, but it infects the image of humidity, of the motive or the place in which they stand, which is soaked in rain and in water. And out of it comes, through the intermediate of the moving over a completely still situation, comes a third aspect. It's very hard to say, but it's obviously synthetic, and it also reminds us synthetic. It might actually make us sick rather than healthy. But we seem to be agreeing that it's an aspect of memory. And the thing with dark optics is that they are a worrisome phenomenon in the sense that they remind us of a madman. Of a madman who no longer distinguishes between the ontological hierarchy among others, but is no longer able to distinguish between time, either in the future, the past, the present, but is also no longer able to distinguish between the reality of the materials around him. And that brings me to this thesis that I have about the camera and about the lens, is that these 200 years of photography provided for humankind, in a way, provided an analogy of, and actually made us not to turn into complete madmen. It provided a constant analogy with a world outside there that seems coherent. And in the world of dark optics, of course, that disappears. And the madman has to analyze himself without a psychoanalyst. Yeah? So there is only the collectivity of materials disintegrates. And this should not be such a surprise. It has to do with radical individuality. And when the hierarchy of materials no longer exists the way it was, one has to solve every problem on one's own. So that I'm sure that it's not possible to become collectively mad, but it is necessarily to generate a new type of collectivity through what I would say radical digitalization, what I would call digital.
Maybe we get back to Olympia for a few minutes, because this is very radical, but it refers to also to a history of radicalism. When I say it refers to, the problem is there's nothing to refer to, actually. Anyway, we have like a lot of associations, like the history, like the building, like the stone, like the plants, the growing, development, movement, duration, light, impressionism. There's so many things involved in that. And in the end, we have, or at least I have to admit, there's nothing where it refers to. It's only me that brings in all these ideas. So you can speak of Olympia as a totally empty artwork.
Yeah, isn't it strange that when we speak about image technologies, we always forget one aspect, and that is the person looking. It's as if conceptually the onlooker is ausgeschaltet, is replaceable. And in Olympia, the motive is very simple. You have a building which lends itself very much to kind of visual theater, belongs really only in the margin to the Third Reich. It was actually a little bit like Putin does now with the World Cup. It was a promotion campaign. Hitler didn't like the idea of the Olympic Stadium, but when his ministers pointed out how many people would actually recognize his government, he quickly changed his mind. And so essentially the building really has, it does have a militaristic rhetoric, but a militaristic rhetoric can have a poetry. This is the problem of the Olympic Stadium, is that it does have a poetry. It's very hard to speak about it. But there is a relation to beauty, and partly it resides also in the repetition, which is endless. One could say the Olympic Stadium is this kind of techno music without a beginning and without an end. It's also designed to make you lose your orientation. So as a motive, it was of course very good to work with, and this is not how I find my ideas, by listing a number of concepts and then looking for it. It's just, when I stood one day there, it all came, and it comes, I'm Catholic, as you will find, it comes as it comes as a true idea, in the sense that the whole package is there completely without any need for and then you just, as an artist, you just have to build everything and make sure that it becomes an ecosystem that lives. And then of course there's the weeds, which were the most fascinating thing, because I imagined that instead of talking about the Third Reich, we would all the time be talking about weeds. Which, wouldn't that be wonderful? Yeah? You would have in front of you, you would have a political item or a political motive which is unavoidable, brings us back to an aspect of history which is almost tourism. And we would find ourselves speaking about weeds and about the growth of plants, which is not unlike what I've done in the Algiers sections of A Happy Moment a while ago, when what you see is a motive which works suspicious to the anti-terrorist gaze, where you have a sort of innocent moment of happiness between young men, essentially, on the roofs of the Kasbah. And then you have the seagulls that look down quite threateningly. They don't look down quite threateningly, but it just transforms over the minutes like that. And what I look for always, I think, is to have a motive which would be politically very hot, and find a way of cooling it down, not neutralizing it. It's not about neutralizing it. But make an act of revenge which could not be more indirect than with plants or with seagulls or with... And what is the act of revenge? One could say it's maybe on Nazi Germany. In fact, it isn't. It's on ideological time, on the concept of... or the arrogance that exists in imagining an empire which will last for... And if there's one thing that we've learned from software, is that software promises two things, which is why Olympia is a piece of software. Software promises eternity, but also redundance, immediate redundance. It's a paradox of the medium. We don't have access to the code. We don't see it. It is invisible. Therefore, it is actually, it cannot be closed off. It is eternal in a way. But at the same time, daily reality is that software needs updating constantly. So it does have an analogy, in fact, with the life of other organisms.
And this brings us back to the very beginning. The only thing that stays or remains is the duration and the time period, day and night, and the seasons. And this means also sunlight and darkness of the night, and which is very important. So I would call your art also a type of impressionist or whatever, digital impressionism.
I think it's quite right to refer to impressionism. In the margin of that, I've always found that impressionists were not what they were credited with. They were a profoundly ideological reaction to photography and to the hegemony of photography and this instant image. So if there's one aspect that unites impressionism, it's the burning power of light. You know, even if it's only from memory, and in fact, if it disintegrates into dots or in pure painterly materials. So in the sense, it's a dialectic between materials.
So now we have almost noon. This means the sun has reached its top. Are there any questions from you, dear audience? If not,
you're all baked in the sun.
Actually, the Kunsthaus is cold all day and all night. So, thank you, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for coming.
And to you, please enter the Kunsthaus. It's cold, and you get a coffee and a water there.
Thank you.